Sports Fluent Fantasy Live. I'm your host, Anthony K. And before we kick off the show this week, I wanted to talk about some changes to the Sports Fluent network. So, really exciting stuff. We've added 7 new podcasts to the platform, to the network, and I want to talk about 3 just to kick it off, and we're going to preview them kind of at the beginning of every show every week. So we've added The Window, which is a gambling and betting sports podcast. You can check that out now wherever you find your favorite podcasts. It'll be up on sportsfluent.com within a couple of days. But if you need any gambling or betting advice on sports, The Window is the one to check out. We've also added Broline Talks Hockey, and obviously it's all about hockey. That one has kicked off. Again, you can find that anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. And the last one this week that we're going to preview is Empire State Your Mind. It's all about New York sports with some debate from a couple of people from Boston. So be sure to check out those 3 podcasts on the Sports Fluent Network. Now, while you're here, it's all about the starts and sits for this week in fantasy football. So our first start of the week is our QB, Taysom Hill. He's in Denver, and he's facing the Broncos, who have given up 18-plus fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. If you were lucky enough last week and you were in an ESPN league, you could have started him as a tight end. So I'm in a league with 2 QBs, and we were able to basically start 3 because I had 2 starting QBs and a tight end. Unfortunately, ESPN figured that one out, and they've now taken that tight end designation off of Taysom Hill. Hopefully you took advantage of that last week if you're in an ESPN league. Otherwise now, he's just a QB, but he's still a start this week at Denver. The second start is going to be Derek Carr. I'm high on Derek Carr moving forward. I think he's really shown in fantasy and in just regular football that he's become a player. And this week he's got the Atlanta Falcons, who have given up 29-plus fantasy points to quarterbacks 4 times this season. So look for Derek Carr to have a big game this week at Atlanta. To our sits. And this one hurts because I had such high hopes for him. And they're still in first place in their division. But let's be honest, Carson Wentz is a sit every single week moving forward. He is a sit. I don't know if they're going to put in Jalen Hurts, but they probably should. And I know it's tough for a team that's leading the division, but when you're leading the division with 3 wins and you're, below 500, you got to do something, because the Cowboys look like they're starting to figure it out last week with Andy Dalton back. The Giants are playing much better in that division. Washington has a defense that, needs to be looked at this season. Like, it really is a 4-team race for that NFC East. So back to fantasy. Carson Wentz versus Seattle, which seems like a good matchup, but he's definitely a sit moving forward. If not a drop, again, unless you're in a deeper kind of 2 QB or super flex league. The second sit this week, Ryan Tannehill. He's at the Colts. It's a terrible matchup with that Colts defense. They've only given up more than 13 fantasy points twice this season. And that was to Aaron Rodgers and to Lamar Jackson. So be careful. Ryan Tannehill this week is a sit. Then our sleeper of the week. Talked about the Giants a little bit a second ago. Daniel Jones. Great matchup at Cincinnati. He's getting Sterling Shepard back. It's a good opportunity if you have some injuries at quarterback, or like I said, if you're in a deeper league or you stream your quarterbacks, Daniel Jones is one you might want to take a look at. And then the bust alert is my good friend, Baker Mayfield. Now, on paper, looks like a good matchup against the Jags, but do you trust Baker Mayfield? My answer is no, I don't, especially considering they're going to rely heavily on the run this week at the Jags. And between Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb, he's just not going to have that many opportunities. So I'm sitting Baker Mayfield this week. To your questions, of course, about quarterbacks. Joe Burrow is out for the rest of the season. What does that mean for T. Higgins? It means that you better start looking for another wide receiver. I don't like the Cincinnati quarterback situation right now. So I would be very careful with T. Higgins. Hopefully, he's kind of a flex play for you. And if that's the case, again, it's going to be matchup dependent. But I'd start to fade on T. Higgins moving forward because of that Joe Burrow injury. To our running backs. Our first start of the week this week is Wayne Gallman of the New York Giants. I like this matchup. Again, it's against the Bengals. You got to pick on those weaker defenses, and I think it's a good opportunity to start him this week. He's going to have a nice game. I think the Giants' offense is going to get rolling a little bit this week. Cincinnati seems to be one of those teams that, it's one of those teams that you get right with. So look for him to have a big game this week. The second one, and this was one where we talked about a few weeks ago, right? When McCaffrey came back, Mike Davis was a definite sit. McCaffrey is hurt again. And as long as McCaffrey is hurt, Mike Davis is a start. He's at Minnesota, especially in PPR leagues. He's a good start to have. To our sits, Melvin Gordon versus New Orleans this week. So two things with Melvin Gordon. Obviously, we know that he hasn't had a great fantasy season anyways. He had Philip Lindsay taking some of his snaps. And New Orleans gives up the fewest points to running backs in fantasy. So he's definitely a sit this week. The second one has two of the worst it's the worst case scenario. You got a bad matchup against the San Francisco 49ers. You also have a committee timeshare, and not just two, but three running backs. So Darrell Henderson is a sit because Malcolm Brown's taking some of his touches. Cam Akers is coming on a little bit. So I'm fading Darrell Henderson as much as possible. To our sleeper, and we thought this was going to be the year that Devin Singletary kind of popped off for the Bills, but it's been more Zach Moss, and he's been getting a lot of the goal line touches, which obviously is important in fantasy. And he's going up against a Los Angeles Chargers team that has given up 8 touchdowns to running backs in the last 5 games. So look for Zach Moss to have a big game this week as well. Be careful of Leonard Fournette. I know what you're thinking. This is a game against Kansas City, and the Bucs are going to be throwing the ball, and he's the back in Tampa that is coming out of the backfield as a receiver more so than Ronald Jones. However, he had 3 drops in the last game, and I don't think they're going to be looking for him that much. So be careful of Leonard Fournette if you're looking to start him this week against the Kansas City Chiefs. Question 2 on running backs. Should I start Frank Gore over Clyde Edwards-Helaire? No, you shouldn't. I know Frank Gore looks appealing, and in terms of waiver wire, you might want to look at picking him up because he's not rostered. I think about 15% of leagues he's only rostered in. However, you're not benching Helaire. It's a good matchup against the Bucs. Not a great matchup, but he's also a receiver out of the backfield. I don't think you got to worry about Le'Veon Bell as much. I know he scored a touchdown last week, but still Hillier is kind of the main back. Even on a good day, I don't think Frank Gore is going to be able to do much this week. So no, I wouldn't make that move. To our wide receivers now. Justin Jefferson versus Carolina. He's at home. They've given up the 6th most points to outside wide receivers, which is where he plays. Out of all teams in fantasy, that's a good matchup. I'm very high on Justin Jefferson. My other one is a surprise because I don't talk much about their offense, but Devontae Parker at the New York Jets. The Jets give up the 6th most points to wide receivers, regardless of where they line up. So that's another really good matchup against the Jets. You got to pick on on those Bengals, on those Jets. When you have your players going up against them. And this is one of those situations where Devontae Parker has a really good matchup, and he's a start. To our sits, this is another one where I had really high hopes for him this season based on what happened last year. However, Marquise Brown at Pittsburgh this week. Someone made the comment, we think the Hollywood show might be canceled, and I think that's the case. He hasn't lived up to expectations this year in fantasy, and he doesn't have a very good matchup against Pittsburgh, so I'm definitely sitting him this week. Corey Davis is the other sit at the Colts, right? Stay away from those Colts matchups. They're a really good defense, and they don't give up fantasy points. So it's a bad matchup. I'm also sitting Corey Davis from Tennessee this week. To our sleepers, and this one has more to do with, I think he's one of those players that will have a good game every once in a while, anyways. But when you have two injuries to Randall Cobb and Kenny Stills, Brendan Cooks at Detroit has a nice matchup, and because of the injuries, he's going to get some additional targets this week. So look for him to have a good week as well. My bust alert, and it's too bad because I've started him the last few weeks and he's done okay, but Christian Kirk at New England is a bad matchup that I would stay away from unless, DeAndre Hopkins was listed as questionable today. I think that's just rest. But obviously this changes if DeAndre Hopkins does play, then definitely, right? Then this changes. But if he's playing, then Christian Kirk is be careful of Christian Kirk. So to our questions, Sony Michel's fantasy impact with Burkhead out. Listen, you can't trust the New England Patriots and their running back situation. We really don't know who's going to be playing. However, we know that Damian Williams has started to Damian Harris has started to really take the bulk of the running game, and everybody else is just kind of fighting for those receptions. But I wouldn't put money on it, right? I wouldn't bet on Sony Michel having a big game because you just never know with those New England backs. So I'd be careful on that one. To our tight ends, he's had a nice, it's been a nice season, and it's been tough to find consistency at tight end, right? He hasn't had as many of those bigger games that we really would like to see, but he's had some very good games, last week being one of them. But Darren Waller of the Raiders this week against Atlanta, who has given up the most points to tight ends in fantasy this season. So it's a great matchup. And I think he's really, it's tough to find good people at the tight end position. So this is a really good matchup for him. So I'm definitely starting Darren Waller. Next one, I think I had him as a sit 5 weeks in a row. I actually think I said drop him. But it looks like Rob Gronkowski is fantasy relevant again. So I'm starting him this week against the Kansas City Chiefs. They've given up top 7 performances in 2 of their last 4 games. And he's had 4 touchdowns in the last 6 games, which actually ties him for the most touchdowns out of the tight end position, ties him for first. So he's producing. He's got a good matchup. I'm going with Gronkowski. Welcome back. I'm sitting, however, my tight end, Jimmy Graham. He's at Green Bay this week. And here's the funny part. I'm very big. If you've ever listened to the show before, I'm huge on revenge games. And Jimmy Graham playing his old team in the Packers, right? It's a revenge game. No, I think this is going to be a revenge game for the Packers on him. And it's not a good matchup. They've stopped kind of looking to him in the red zone. Now it changes a little bit because that's been with Nick Foles. Obviously this week they're probably starting Mitch Trubisky. So that does change a little bit. But Jimmy Graham is a sit for me. The next one, and I feel like I've had a lot of high hopes for these guys this week. Jordan Reed at the Rams just hasn't kind of done what we expected him to do. The good news is he stayed healthy, and that's been the biggest. That's been the biggest thing we've been worried about, is that we're worried about his injuries, but he stayed healthy. He's just not producing. So I'm sitting Jordan Reed this week at tight end. The Dalton to Dalton show, however, might be back in Big D. So look for Dalton Schultz this week against Washington, who average 14 points to tight ends. That's a good matchup. So I'm going Dalton Schultz as your sleeper. The sit, however, is going to be Tyler Higbee, who's got a bad matchup against the 49ers. He's also kind of sharing snaps at the tight end position with Everett. And, of course, the 49ers give up the fewest points to tight ends. So you want to stay away from Higbee. So we got some questions coming in. Let's see. Darcy, give me a QB streamer. I had Matt Ryan last week and Jared Goff the week before. Those really worked. So you might have missed the beginning. We started off by saying Daniel Jones against Cincinnati if you're streaming, unless you're in one of those leagues where maybe like Taysom Hill is still available. I don't think you're going to find Derek Carr available in most leagues, but Daniel Jones would be my streamer this week against Cincinnati. Previous question that was sent in. What do we do with Kamara now? Okay, so this question comes to us probably because last week, that first week that Hill started, you saw Kamara sharing the ball a little bit more with Latavius Murray, and obviously Hill. When Hill's there every play, he's a threat to run, so that does take away from Kamara's running game a little bit. He does make up for it, obviously, because he's such a good receiver as well. So what I do with him is I put Kamara in and I start him every week. Like, your expectations of what he's going to do might come down a little bit. However, Kamara's a plug and play. If he's healthy, if he's playing, he's in your lineup. So there's really not much you can do about that. You just got to hope that Hill kind of starts to throw the ball a little bit more to him, or they run Kamara a little bit more, for the next couple of weeks until Drew Brees gets back, which is outstanding, by the way. If he comes back from 11 broken ribs in 3 weeks, like, that dude's fantastic. To our tight ends. Oh, no, we did tight ends already. So our last question, is Deontay Johnson a weekly starter? Yeah, Deontay. We've talked a lot about Deontay Johnson since pre-draft. We told you that he's going to have a big role in that Pittsburgh Steelers offense. We always knew that offense was able to sustain multiple wide receivers, and we thought Juju was obviously going to be the number one, but they really don't have a clear-cut number one, right? Between Juju, when James Washington is healthy, Deontay Johnson, obviously Chase Claypool, right? There's a lot of wide receiver there, but I think Deontay Johnson. So a couple of things about him: 75%. He's in on 75% of the snaps. He's averaging 11 targets per game. He's averaging 77 yards per game. So he's getting enough opportunities that I think you're safe to start Deontay Johnson every week. To our top, so we're going to do top performers and then some of your waiver wires. So last week we talked about PPR. This week we're going to do standard league. So last week's top performers in standard scoring at the QB position. Number one was Deshaun Watson, 31.36. Justin Herbert, we told you he was a definite start last week, 27.74. Taysom Hill, again, if you started him at tight end in those ESPN leagues, you're not getting 24.42 points out of a tight end very often, so that would have been nice for you. But as a quarterback, he was also QB3. Running back, Cook with 20 was your number one running back last week. Hillier, 19.7, and Derrick Henry, 19.2, with that fantastic touchdown in overtime. I call it fantastic because I have him in one of my leagues, and he won the game for me, so you got to love it. Thielen at the wide receiver position with 24.3. I'm going to say his name wrong, but Demire Bird with 20.3, and then Robert Woods at 18.6 was your third wide receiver in terms of standard scoring last week. And then at tight ends, right, it's the typical names that you're hearing, and this is why it's tough when you're streaming tight ends, which is what I do, because you have Kelsey, Andrews, and Waller at 18, 15, and 14. Respectively, and that's those are the names you could probably hear at tight end moving forward for the rest of the fantasy year. We're getting close to playoff time, so as we are getting close to playoff time, we talked a little bit last week about handcuffing some of your running backs. That is a definite, right? Depending on where your teams are, if they're fighting for a playoff position, they're probably going to give their lead back the majority of snaps. Obviously, if there's an injury, you got to worry about that. So if you have Kamara, you might want to pick up Latavius Murray. If you have Ezekiel Elliott, who, the good thing is, as bad as the Cowboys have been, they're in the hunt for a playoff spot. So it's not like they're going to rest Zeke and give Tony Pollard a lot of snaps. But again, should he get hurt? Should something happen? Should they go on a losing streak or a winning streak for that matter? You might want to keep Pollard kind of handcuffed. Sorry, so to the waivers. So we mentioned Taysom Hill. He's only rostered in 65% of leagues. So he's still out there in certain places. So he's one that I would pick up. Mentioned Daniel Jones already. He's only rostered in 30% of leagues. So he has actually a really nice row of games coming up as well. So if you do stream, he might be one that you can start and play a couple of times. Gus Edwards, who was on our kind of sit list, and we didn't know what to do with that Baltimore backfield because it was such a timeshare. However, now with a couple of injuries, Gus Edwards, right, again, only rostered in 43% of leagues, so he's one you want to look at. And then Sterling Shepard. Sorry, excuse me. So I mentioned Frank Gore. He's only rostered in 15% of leagues. And Frank Gore, like, I don't think this week's the week for him, but if you're kind of needing some running back help, he's still one that you kind of plug in there as a flex maybe a couple of times before the season ends. To wide receivers now, so I mentioned Sterling Shepard. Now that he looks like he's going to be back this week, that kind of matches you up with that Daniel Jones pick. He's only rostered in 51% of leagues, so again, he's also available. And then Pittman. So Pittman for the Colts, that's one where I'm surprised that he's only rostered in 45% of leagues. I think that number changes over the next couple of days, so that probably will go up significantly. He's turning into the number one receiver for Phillip Rivers there, so he's definitely one that I would pick up if you haven't already. Then tight ends, we obviously mentioned Dalton Schultz. He's only rostered in 40% of leagues. They're in Dallas. Him and Andy Dalton seems to have kind of a good chemistry going, so that's one that can give you some production out of the tight end position. And then same thing, as I mentioned, Akins, because of some injuries, right? He's only rostered in 25% of leagues, so look for Akins as well to give you some good tight end production. And I think that is it for your questions for this week. Again, remember to check out The Window, Broly Talk Sports, and that's Broly. And just because there's some questions about maybe I pronounced it incorrectly, Broly, Broalie. So it's like Broly. It's like a goalie, but with bro in front of it. So Broly Talks Hockey. That's a definite one to check out. And then Empire State Your Mind, everything you need to know about New York sports, with some Boston debate. So check out those shows. Obviously, check out the Sports Fluent podcast, and we'll be talking some more fantasy football next week. Until then, have a good night.